Some of the greatest blockbuster movies have been based on true events. Whether it's a horror, comedy, or an action-packed movie replicating a historical disaster, movies are a great way of showcasing an event in history in an entertaining and educational way. But it's also great to hear the real-life stories that inspired these great films. So here we look at 5 huge Hollywood disaster movies and the true events they were based on. In 1995, Ron Howard directed an all-star cast film called Apollo 13. It follows 3 astronauts and their attempt for a third moon landing. Catastrophe occurs when en route the rocket experiences an onboard explosion that limits the oxygen and electric supply, putting the astronauts in serious danger. The film shows NASA's desperate battle to return the 3 astronauts safely back to Earth, and as you may know, it's all based on the true disaster that was Apollo 13. On April the 11th, 1970, Apollo 13 launched from the Kennedy Space Center with 3 astronauts on board. Commander Jim Lovell, the most experienced crew member who had already completed 3 missions, lunar module pilot Fred W. Hayes, and first-time flyer Jack Swigert, who was a last-minute replacement. The first 2 days after liftoff, everything seemed to be running smoothly, but 55 hours into the flight, the crew made a TV broadcast, and just 9 minutes after the broadcast ended, oxygen tank number 2 blew up, causing tank 1 to stop working. The supply of electric, light, and water were also lost at this point, and the crew were 200,000 miles from Earth, a very bad place for things to be going wrong. At 9:08 p.m, Swigert saw a warning light and uttered the words to the ground crew, "Houston, we've had a problem here."
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
We've had a hardware restart.
Houston, we've had a problem.
This line was changed in the film to the more famous words we all know, "Houston, we have a problem."
This is Houston. Say again, please?
Houston, we have a problem.
Lovell realized that one oxygen tank was empty and the other was emptying rapidly. The crew acted quickly to try and preserve the remaining oxygen, but it was apparent to ground crew and the astronauts that the service module would soon run out of oxygen, which would cause the fuel cell to die. It was decided that the crew would have to transfer to the lunar module if they were to have any chance of returning to Earth. With just 15 minutes of power left, the crew transferred to the lunar module but were faced with another problem. This module was only designed for landing on the moon and providing an operating base while there. Therefore, it only had 45 hours worth of life, and the return journey to Earth would take 90 hours. The ground crew calculated that oxygen would not be a problem, and that with energy-saving measures there would be enough power, but they would however have to severely ration their water consumption, and build a contraption to remove the carbon dioxide buildup in the capsule. Back at ground control, the objective was to return the 3 astronauts back to Earth safely. To do this, the spacecraft was maneuvered to a free-run trajectory that would enable it to loop around the moon and return to Earth. The condition was difficult, energy systems were turned off to conserve power, and the temperature in the capsule dropped to around 40 degrees. A lot of moisture built up in the spacecraft, which made it very uncomfortable for the 3 astronauts. As the spacecraft entered the Earth's atmosphere, the crew moved back to the command area and released the lunar module. After a heart-stopping journey from space, the mission was now back on target and the astronauts were able to land safely just 1 mile off course. It was truly an incredible feat, and the real-time NASA communications and video footage had everyone watching on the edge of their seats. Everest. Mount Everest is the most popular and recognized mountain on the planet. It's located in the Himalayas and its highest point is 8,850 meters above sea level. It's the ultimate climbing challenge, and many have died and still lay to rest on the mountain in an attempt to reach its peak. But the 1996 Everest disaster, up until 2014, was the worst disaster to have ever taken place on Everest. It was caused by a sudden turn in weather conditions, as well as some miscalculations and the amount of people climbing that caused a bottleneck to the top of the summit, slowing down the climbers and resulting in the turnaround times not being met. While the 2015 film Everest is the reenactment of this tragedy that claimed the lives of 8 people who were caught up in the horrific blizzard on Mount Everest. The film stars many A-list actors, and although it's handled in a sensitive way, it doesn't come close to the real thing. On the 10th of May 1996, 4 separate climbing expeditions were taking place on Mount Everest. The adventure consultants Mountain Madness, the Taiwanese expedition, and the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. 2 of the expeditions had already reached the summit and were making their way down, and climbers from the other 2, Mountain Madness and the Adventure Consultants, were on or just descending from the top, when a ferocious and unexpected blizzard stopped them in their tracks. At the time, Scott Fisher, the Mountain Madness lead climbing guide, was running behind due to an unexpected previous incident, and by the time the storm hit, he was at the top of the south summit and his group were descending to their next checkpoint. Even the most experienced climbers in the team struggled to move even minimal distances, and Scott Fisher started to talk irrationally and told the other climber who was with him to go get help. The other climber agreed and left Scott near the summit, and this was the last time he would see him. By now they were all over 26,000 feet above sea level, the temperature was minus 40 degrees, and the snow was pelting their faces with winds of over 70 miles an hour. The team members started to split up in an attempt to secure routes, and it was soon clear that the worsening weather conditions were making it impossible for the climbers to do anything. Visibility was nil, the snow was burying their ropes, and the route back was now invisible. Frostbitten hands and feet were hampering the stronger climbers, making it difficult for them to help some of the weaker ones. Difficult decisions had to be made, and the weaker climbers were left to succumb to the freezing conditions. In total, 8 climbers lost their lives as a direct result of the blizzards on the 10th and the 11th of May 1996. 4 from the Adventure Consultants, 1 from Mountain Madness, and 3 from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Many of their frozen bodies, including Scott's, remain on the mountain, along with Rob Hall, the Adventure Consultants expedition leader, who, after a lengthy battle against the blizzard on his descent from the summit, called his wife and said, "Sleep well, my sweetheart, please don't worry too much," before passing away. The men that did survive during the blizzard all have incredible tales to tell that could not be given justice in a 2-hour movie, including Beck Weathers, played by Josh Brolin in the movie, who, despite being left to die twice and suffering severe frostbite and hypothermia, still managed to make it out alive after being rescued by a helicopter, an incredible feat in itself at that altitude. Beck is a true warrior and fought death with nothing but mind over matter, using his family for inspiration. Titanic. There have been many Titanic films, the most popular being the 1997 James Cameron version starring Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. It's a love story that takes place on the RMS Titanic, and at the time it was the most expensive film ever made, and for over 10 years was the highest grossing film of all time. On April 10, 1912, RMS Titanic, the largest and grandest ocean liner ever built at the time, left Southampton, England on her maiden voyage to New York. Its launch was huge, and she was thought to be unsinkable and the safest ship ever built. Titanic's owner, the White Star Line, had spared no expense, and they were so confident that the ship was unsinkable that only 20 lifeboats were aboard, only enough for half of the 2,200 passengers. On April 14th at 10:40 p.m, Titanic hit an iceberg. Believing the ship was indestructible, the crew thought nothing of it, but she had been fatally damaged and the ice-cold water started to pour in. It was soon apparent that the Titanic was sinking, and with the lack of lifeboats on board and the nearest ship miles away, the outlook for the passengers was dreadful. Survivors later recalled the desperate scramble for lifeboats and the horrible realization when they ran out. They also described passengers clinging to anything they could as the ship slowly slid into the ocean. At 2:24 a.m., less than 3 hours after hitting the iceberg, the Titanic was nearly 4 kilometers deep at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Those that were not pulled down with it or got into lifeboats were left bobbing in the freezing ocean, unable to survive the perishing conditions. Just 705 of the 2,200 passengers and crew survived, making the Titanic to this day one of the most devastating and famous sea accidents in history. In the Heart of the Sea. In 2015, Warner Brothers released a film starring Chris Hemsworth about a whaling ship called the Essex. While it was actually based on the true story of the Essex, which was also the inspiration for one of the most famous novels in history, Moby Dick. And here is the actual story of the Essex and how the men on board had to resort to eating each other to stay alive. In 1819, the Quaker-owned whaling ship the Essex left Nantucket, a small island off of Cape Cod, on the eastern side of America. Captain George Pollard Jr. and his crew were sent out to hunt and kill sperm whales, mostly for their valuable oil. As far as hunting goes, it was going good, and by November they had about 96 barrels of whale oil on board. As the new year of 1820 dawned, they pushed further out into the Pacific, and one of the most extraordinary and unheard of events happened. An 80-ton sperm whale set its sights on the Essex and rammed it once, followed by a second more powerful attack before swimming off and never being seen again. It's important to know that whales during this time were recorded to be considerably bigger than today's whales. This monster of a creature damaged the ship badly, and it was quickly taking on water and started to sink. The crew in the 3 surrounding small whale boats that followed looked on in horror as their mother ship sank, and the crew of the Essex climbed onto the 3 smaller boats that were now left drifting in the ocean with nowhere to go. In total, there were 20 men in the 3 boats. They had minimal amounts of fresh water and hardly any food, and quickly began to dehydrate. After 3 weeks adrift, they landed on Henderson Island. Unable to sustain themselves, 16 of them decided to cast off again and tried to head east in an attempt to reach the South American coast, and the others stayed on the island. The 3 small boats battled on through rough weather, and one of the boats became separated from the others. The situation was now desperate, and one by one the crew started to die of starvation. It was becoming apparent that to survive they would have to start eating the dead crewmates. In total, 7 crewmen were chopped up and eaten, 6 of which had died of starvation, and the 7th, Owen Coffin, the captain's first cousin, was the unfortunate sailor who drew the short straw and was killed to be eaten. By now, one of the whaleboats had disappeared and the other 2 were drifting miles apart. On February the 18th, after 89 days at sea, the last 3 surviving men on one of the boats were rescued. Then the second boat was found, and legend has it that the rescuers were greeted with the horrific sight of the 2 remaining crew members still sucking the marrow from their dead shipmates' bones. Not long after, a ship was sent to Henderson Island, where the 3 marooned sailors who were close to death were rescued. Years later, a whaleboat was discovered washed up on a tiny island called Ducie Island. Inside this ghostly vessel were 3 skeletons, and it's long been thought that this was the lost whaleboat, but it's never been confirmed. Despite my hatred for their whale hunting, this is a true story of survival at sea, and the film is well worth a watch. The 33. You'll probably remember the Chilean mining accident that took place in 2010. It was front headlines on the news for weeks, and everyone was talking about it. I also remember everyone saying this would make a great movie. Well, in August 2015, 5 years after the accident, Hollywood production film The 33 was released, initially in Chile before staggered releases everywhere else. It tells the story of the 33 trapped miners and the massive bid to rescue the men before they starved to death. It had a good review and stars a few Hollywood actors, including Antonio Banderas, who plays Mario Sepulveda, the miner who kept morale high throughout the miners' ordeal, and Juliette Binoche, who portrays Maria Segovia, the sister of one of the trapped miners who acted as a spokesperson for the families, and pestered the Chilean authorities to take action to rescue her brother and the other miners. The film is a great portrayal of the mining disaster, but knowing the full story makes it even more engaging. It started on the afternoon of the 5th of August when miners at a 121-year-old mine in Chile's Atacama Desert were excavating copper, gold, and other minerals. Without warning, there was a huge explosion and all exit routes were blocked with debris. 33 miners were now trapped 700 meters underground and discovered that the blockage was a 770,000-ton stone that had broken away from the rest of the mounting and sealed them in. When the 33 men didn't return home, they were reported missing and a rescue team got to work. But since the miners had no way of contacting the outside world, rescuers and the families were left unsure if it was a rescue or a recovery mission. 9 drilling machines were brought in and started drilling boreholes deep underground to send listening probes down. Remarkably, after 17 days, rescuers found a note attached to one of them saying all 33 of us are well inside the shelter. The miners had survived on meager rations for 17 days, but now rescuers were able to send food, water, clothing, and a communication system down there. Experts decided the best way of getting them out alive was to drill a shaft and pull them out. The miners worked together in clearing the debris as the holes were being drilled to the shaft. It was also important for them to remain active and keep their weight down, so they were slim enough to fit into the rescue capsule. On the 9th of October, as the whole rescue operation was being watched worldwide, the drill finally broke through to where the miners were and the rescue capsule was put in position. It took a few days for things to get in place, and on Tuesday the 13th, Manuel Gonzalez, one of the rescuers, got in the capsule and was lowered down into the mine shaft to be greeted by the trapped men. But instead of coming back to the surface as expected, he swapped places with one of the miners. Florencio Avalos became the first miner to be rescued, and by Wednesday evening, after 69 days trapped in darkness, all 33 miners had been rescued. They thought their living hell was over, but for many of them, including Mario Sepulveda, the miner who shouted Viva Chile when being rescued and who the media called Super Mario, it was the start of another hell. Despite the fame and offers of free holidays and book deals, the attention was just too much for some of them. Mario, the hero of the $40 million movie, now lives in darkness with little money and recently said he was going back to work in the mine as it was the only place he felt safe. He states that many of the other miners are unable to cope with the stress of getting a ton of attention, only to be forgotten and left to face the aftermath of their trauma alone. If only there was a way to give the men the help they deserve, the story would have a much happier ending. So that's 5 Hollywood movies that are based on true disasters. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you want to read or even write your own articles similar to topics like this and my other videos, then go check out the new Top 5's website.